Welcome to Funders on Fundraising. I'm Jeffrey McDougall of Aspiration. I've spent the last 3 decades raising money for mission-driven work and thinking hard about how power moves through our sector.
And I'm Kelly James with Education First Consulting. I've been a program officer, a philanthropic strategist, and someone trying to make grant-making more human, direct, and transparent.
This podcast is a candid conversation about how money really moves and how we can build authentic, useful relationships between funders and fundraisers. We're co-produced by Chris Lawrence and Andrew Calloway and Decca Hussein Wetzel of Urbanist Media.
We're talking to people who've sat on both sides of the table. People who know what it means to ask for money, give it away, and navigate everything in between.
Today's episode is with Sasha Rabkin, Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at AERDF, the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund.
This one gets into what it means to evolve from rebellion to strategy, from resisting broken systems to trying to change them from the inside. Sasha talks to us about his time in an intentional revolutionary community, how he thinks about contradiction, and how he shows up now as someone who moves significant investments.
We also dig into influence, trust, and how people actually get decisions made.
Let's get into it. I wanted to talk a little bit around how you're building the Sasha that's going to be the grant maker. And I know AERDF is unique from Sasha, who was a fundraiser. And when you think on the fundraiser side, if you could point to an authentic relationship that you were able to build with, someone, organization, individual that ultimately gave money, what were some of the tenets of that worked for you, that felt they had like meaningful value, were not transactional, were not only about their title, your title, and some of those values, and then you're then bringing into like how you want to build, how you show up at AERDF.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kelly. I mean, I'd really be interested in how you all kind of understand these relationships too, because I think we say that word a lot, or I say that word a lot, and often I mean very particular people in very particular settings, and I think that's where it starts to feel nuanced. But I think there's a couple things that I learned, and I think as nonprofit leaders, we engage in relationships with philanthropy because we need funding. And we need funding to do the work we do because we don't have the same civil society infrastructure that other countries have, in which things like education and social services are often funded at different levels. And societies are set up in order to enable those. I'm not saying that's necessarily better or worse, but I do think it's, at least without being an economics professor of any kind, a somewhat basic explanation for how we have come to a space in which the nonprofit organizations that offset what the public systems can't do are funded by private philanthropy.
As a Canadian, I can say it's objectively better. I can go
that would be my sense too, but I've never, haven't lived in any places, and I think, but that's my sense. But I also think it's important because to me, so we're in these relationships that often feel insufficient because the system is insufficient, and so we're sort of like doubling down on insufficient and then expecting a lot from each other. And so for me, understanding that was really helpful to take the shine off of feeling like I needed to prove something in order to get money, that we have a mutually agreed upon interest in me needing money and you giving me money. And in fact, sometimes you need me as much as I need you, or even more, because you do have to give the money away. I mean, foundations are set up to do that. So I start with that, Kelly, because to me, that was probably a maturity that moved past the why do I have to go talk to rich people when none of the program officers I actually talk to are quote unquote rich people, right? Like this isn't like I'm actually like, have an audience with the king sort of experience. These are actually people who do something very similar to me. So all of that was a journey that I found to be really helpful to understanding how I relate to people is how I relate to philanthropists, and how I relate to people is finding mutuality.
And you mentioned earlier that some of your most successful funding relationships were the ones where you had more space to play and create and chat as people, not just center the cash, right?
That's right. And I think that that's on us as much as it's on them. Like, I don't think that means it's just their responsibility because they have the money to say, let me create all of this space for me. I think it's incumbent on us as leaders who are trying to raise money to come with ideas that allow for that third space between us, as we would in any relationship, that can blossom and maybe be greater than the sum of the parts. And so to me, that starts from getting to know people. It starts from getting to know what individuals are excited about, not just what they're excited about in their jobs or responsible for, because my profession isn't everything I'm excited about. And so how do we start to learn and understand what inspires and creates opportunity for each of us? And let's start there, because my sense is, in the end, what I've learned is the program officers I work with have to champion my idea to other people. Like, that was my big recognition when I realized that it wasn't just them signing off on it. This was about them learning to champion my idea. Then I was like, well, I need you probably even more than you need me. Like, this is like, we really have to like work with each other here, because in those rooms, when you get asked questions about me, it comes down to, do you believe in me? And do you believe in my idea? Because you have to then go to the mat and say, I'm going to choose this over something else. That whole process was really revealing to me.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that it's not, I mean, generally, if it's your idea versus the idea or our idea.
That's right. That's right.
I want to take the opportunity, based upon something you said, to take a bit of a tangent here, which is you use the term third place, which I love and I use all of the time. And so there's a few, like, sometimes it's definitely creative and intellectual. It's usually emotional. Sometimes it's even physical, coffee shops and hikes as opposed to boardrooms. But there's a lot of destructive tension in the traditional model, where you go to them and they say go, and then you perform, and then you leave. And then surprisingly, a lot of the time, which caught me off guard in my early career, there's actually a lot of destructive tension coming home back to your own org. We're like, so this is what the funder wants. And you get accusations like, well, you're just doing their bidding, or you're just taking the easy way out, or you didn't sell hard enough, or So I was wondering, based upon as tactically as you can consider it, how did you structure and manage that notion of third place? Like, how did you seed it with the funders, and how did you position it with your colleagues?
Yeah, that's a really great question. For me, all of it starts by understanding people. And so I think I'll get to the answer, but I do think it starts by, in the same way that somebody has to be able to champion me, I need to know that the people we're working with aren't going to ask me to do things that they know are not in my interest and in my organization's interest. And so I think there is a real just interpersonal relationship there that has to mean we've actually had conversations that are not about whether we're going to get money. And I mean that really sincerely. And I don't mean that just as like the fluff conversations to pretend like you're building relationships, but actually finding over time. And so part of that for me is tactically saying, if I meet and establish a new funding relationship, I do not expect money. In my mind, I tell myself, for at least a year. Setting aside this idea that I might need it and it might actually come. For me, I tend to think about time as part of what creates a third space. So I think part of it is having to, if you need money in 3 weeks, it's really hard to build a meaningful relationship with somebody. It's not impossible. Then you just have to start there and say, what I really need is money in 3 weeks. But I try to not end up in those relationships. So that's one thing. And I worked at an organization where we had earned revenue and other streams of revenue that allowed for some space that I don't think all people have. The second thing to me is, I think philanthropy's money is best used to strengthen something that has just begun. So to me, part of what happens often is this idea that philanthropy is often used to keep the trains moving, but they have interests. And so if the trains are moving in a certain direction and then they want tweaks or things aren't fully developed, that can often create tension. No, that's not how we do it, but that's how we need it done. And then you end up negotiating this space. What I've found is that really trying to understand, where are we headed and how can philanthropy help us get there, versus where are we and how can philanthropy just strengthen that? And so to me, that meant always tactically trying to find ways. And again, a lot of my experiences with what I think people would call venture philanthropy or sort of philanthropy that's often through folks who made money in technology and have some appetite for that. But finding ways to say, we are just starting out on something and we need support to take this journey. And this journey will have impact, it will have outcomes, it will have all those things, but it is by definition not defined. And then that allows us as an organization to not feel like we have a flag in the ground that we will not yield. But it also allows them, I think, to feel like they're on the front end. And I think people prefer to be on the front end. That was my experience. Again, there's limits to it. But those two things, giving myself time and then really not trying to get money just to do the things we're already doing well, allowed more space to develop. And again, the hope is that it's, the first funding leads to the second funding and the third funding, like also recognizing that There are funders we received money for 9 years in a row.
Yeah.
That's a really powerful relationship, but it starts from kind of incrementally building these visions together.
Yeah, that notion of emergence is really, really powerful.
Yeah.
Because emergence implies that it's already underway. We're not at zero.
Yes.
And emergence implies that it's still going. So there's direction, there's velocity, there's a vector, but it's still open for discussion and debate and co-creation. That's a really powerful place. And to your point, if you're a nonprofit that's been doing something for 25 years and you think you know the answers, a lot of the time you have to create emergence. And that can lead to scope creep. So it gets creative in ways to, like, how do I come up with emergence that isn't false? Right.
Absolutely. I think on the point of emergence, people want to be a part of things.
Yeah.
Starting something is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, there's like, don't put the pressure on people to feel like they're part of starting something, but don't put them at the end where it's already all baked and all they get to do is sprinkle powdered sugar on top of it. Like between all of that is a real opportunity. And I think seeing philanthropy or individual program officers and their mutual interest in funding creative things, because I think a lot of people, like, it's not that their points are given for funding boring, uncreative things, right? I mean, I think a lot of the ones that I've worked with want to fund interesting, dynamic things that sound and could be powerful. So finding that sweet spot, I think, is really helpful. But I also think it helps as an organization leader to then not feel like somebody's going to come in and tell you how to do the thing you're already good at or already doing, but really allow your staff to say, this is where we get oxygen to try out new things. And the relationships become about trial and error and about incubation and innovation rather than about baked, let's just try to get a little bit more substance out of something that's already largely squeezed.
How are you designing your own funding process with that sympathy and understanding in mind? Are you finding yourself following the patterns of what you were handed as a funder and trying to match those? Or coming back to the beginning, are you going against the grain a bit and trying to reshape and allow more space in those conversations from your side of the table?
Yeah. It's I think probably a little bit of both. And I'd answer it at two levels. One, on the folks that we've funded who I manage and lead internally. My role is to both is at the program level. I oversee the currently 3 and soon to be 4 investments. So while I also have a say in who we fund, when we fund, we bring those people into our organization for 4 to 5 years of incubation space in which they are doing breakthrough inclusive research and development projects under our umbrella. So the funding is to join us for this allotted amount of time. And so I think that allows for a couple levels, which is when we bring them in, we have the chance to enable their ability to use the funding for the most creative thing. And so part of my role is to create the space and the infrastructure so that they thrive when they get the money. So that's one thing that is very unique that I think I'd never gotten funding like that, and I think is a truly unique way of funding folks. But the second part is what we do to create an ongoing set of engagements, because we are only funding one project at a time. And so by definition, having people ask me for money, the answer is pretty easy because we don't give it out that way. Right. But what we do and what we can be doing is seeding opportunities for people to think about the ways in which they incubate ideas from certain ways of thinking about it to this language of breakthroughs. And so finding ways, as I think about our program development, to have more opportunities for people to engage more regularly when funding isn't by definition on the table, but in which they're giving the on-ramp to what might be future opportunities and able to plug in. Because while we also make these big grants, then we give sub-grants for a lot of the research and development, but that's led by the individual that we select. So there's a lot of different layers for that I'm currently learning that I think provide the opportunity for me to apply what I think would be a relational, very racial equity, very social justice approach to building that ecosystem so that people feel connected, even though the number of people who receive funding from our organization will always be exponentially smaller than the amount of people that we engage with in a way that even traditional philanthropy, I think, doesn't quite have.
This might be a little bit of a rewind, but I feel like it's always important for me to raise in these conversations when we place so much emphasis on the value of relationships in fundraising, because I also think that's where a lot of the inequities come in. And so, those who are in the spaces that get access to the people, and those are program officers, right? And program officers select where they'll go. And, I think, again, the relationship-based nature of fundraising can also kind of continue to leave those historically on the margins. And so did you engage in any fundraising relationships that are able to break that tension? Or do you think kind of the way you might be able to approach the work in AERDF, again, sounds like more limited relationship, kind of breaking that traditional model? And I don't know that it needs to be broken. Like, I'm trying to balance this tension. Like, well, we need humans to interact, to do good things together. But when it's always the closer we get to power, the closer we get to money, that isn't kind of breaking down, I think, some of those barriers that, you're naming around racial equity, social justice too.
Yeah. Yeah. Without over indexing on the uniqueness of AERDF, I think we're a nonprofit organization that was created as a fund funded by philanthropy to do things and to fund work that often traditional philanthropy can't or doesn't fund because of the runway required and the infrastructure required for breakthroughs. So a lot of fundraising and fund development that I did previously was about scale, which is a version of the breakthrough conversation, but is often about really trying to take something and just have more of it. And that's really important. And for the place that I was at, those were game changers. But the idea of being at a place that is itself not a traditional philanthropy, not a traditional nonprofit, that is still, only 4 or 5 years into this, including a few years incubated at New Schools Venture Fund, that this is really charting some new territory and figuring out how, with the federal government, with traditional philanthropy, with other ways to think about the funding of breakthrough research and development projects into the future of education. That's a different value proposition. So knowing that, I'm interested in how we build an identity, how we build and hold space for those kinds of things. I think at the very tactical level, and probably to the great, to my own probably limitations on calendaring, I've always appreciated being able to talk to people in philanthropy because I think they are a bit less constrained than those of us who run organizations and seeing the field. And I think seeing the field, and maybe that's a word to unpack because I don't always know what the field is, but seeing you as connected to a set of organizations, to themes, to ways of talking, I think was always very helpful to me in both casual and formal conversations with philanthropy. So one thing is for me to find ways and to really commit to find ways of understanding, how do I make myself accessible and the messages that I am learning or the insights that I'm learning so that people feel like they can be inspired and engaged by them without having to then be in all the spaces that I'm in. And so like being a vessel for that information that often can feel like it's out of reach of folks, I think is something that I'm really interested in that then leads, I think, to understanding how do we do these processes? Is there a future for AERDF that's giving smaller grants, really seeding that ecosystem? And again, using that DARPA model or other models of innovation. How do we create languages and vocabularies and trainings and opportunities for people to learn that? I hope that I can do that, but that will, at least in my current role, not often end with money for people. And so I also want to be really thoughtful with that. And I think be really upfront about that, right? Because I think to what you were saying earlier, Jeff, if we're not upfront from the beginning, we're not building a third space by being like, you might get money. Like, we're going to make another open call for proposals here sometime a year from now, but that's a long time. In the meantime, here is what I can offer. And I'll be honest, I don't still know what that is in my current job as I'm learning it, but there has to be something there that I'm going to be seeing that will be insightful to the people I talk to. And I think that's my job. It's not my job just to like be insular.
And there's different ways of doing that are more or less respectful. One of the funders I know takes a lot of pride in the fact that they ask right away, like, what do you need to do? And what are you trying to do? And they think they're being helpful by not wasting the other person's time.
Right.
But what they're also doing is eliminating and deleting all of the space for the person to be persuasive and to sell and to build that relationship by they're entering the transaction right away. So like, how can I be helpful? Right. What do you need from me versus let's chat, let's play, let's explore.
That's the space to find that like middle point though. Cause like I appreciate some of that tactic too, but go ahead, Sasha.
No, I mean, I think I was going to, if our goal, again, I think I've had the privilege of being in places where I didn't necessarily have to raise money to make payroll on a monthly basis. And previously in my career, I was there, and it always felt like those relationships were very inequitable because we weren't ever even getting enough money to know that we would make it very far. So in my previous role, even before the last one, in a community-based organization, we never had money, and we were never getting enough money because, like our economic system broadly, you kind of have to have money to make money. Like it's really hard to get money when you don't have money.
But I'm sure you were asked like how you were going to sustain everything every time too. Like,
right. Everything was about sustainability, which I guess that you asked me. Yeah. You asked me early on in this, Jeff, something I want to burn down. And I think this idea that anybody has sustainability figured out is maybe what I would say now, because I think it really gets us to think about problems. If I'm worried about sustainability, I will by definition minimize my aspiration.
Right. Interesting.
Because I will only start to trend to things that I know I can sustain. And I think ideally we're in relationships. I'm not overly naive about any of this, but we're in relationships in which we are trying things out. And what I appreciate about my current role, why I was able to take work out of an organization and come here, is because I think that's the language that we're using. But that is the ideal. And I think we're often in relationships, particularly as we're starting out in nonprofit leadership, in which we don't have that luxury. Right. And I think it ends up in these really fraught relationships where people that I know who are completely torn up by their need to engage with their relationship with philanthropy, because it always feels reductive.
Yeah.
And it always feels like it is constraining their aspirations, not enlivening them. I've witnessed that, but I haven't necessarily been a part of that over the last decade or so.
And then every time we talk to a funder, either through this podcast or directly, the number one thing they all say is like, I also want to play. I also want to learn.
That's right.
I also want to talk about things that aren't just money, right? So it's like the forced stance that neither person wants, which is part of one of the ideas behind this podcast is to start trying to kill some of that construct, right?
I think that's really important. And to me, that's the third space. Yeah. Like between organizations and philanthropy, there is, I think, at best, a playground, a sandbox, a place to do these things and have these conversations. So part of me for imagining my role as I get better at it is to create spaces and be a person in which people can talk to find that space. Yeah. And that because I have the luxury of that in a job that gives me time and space to do that, but also because I'm proximate to conversations that are at the $25 to $40 million level about the future of education, I think gives me an incredible amount of privilege and therefore responsibility to translate that to folks who are just trying to get their first $50,000 grant from their local community bank. And I think somewhere between all of that, I can probably be helpful.
Right.
I'm not sure
how.
That
tees up perfectly the question I wanted to play with, which was you mentioned earlier sort of the power and privilege of being a funder and being in these rooms at this point in your career. And I'm wondering if you could maybe do like the classic breakdown. What forms of power and privilege did you think existed on the funder side that are like, yes, of course, this exists? And then what were some of the surprising limitations or constraints that you're experiencing on the funder side?
By definition, I think when we engage with philanthropy, there's always both an economic and a positional imbalance in which there is a level of resources at the disposal of philanthropy that seems to be endless and yet always seems constrained. And that feels like it ends up in this sort of, that's where this kind of like often seen as a little bit duplicitous in that role, where like it seems like you have all of the money in the world, but you're making it so hard for me to get it. And so I think those power dynamics is something that I've seen, that I've witnessed, I think are often to the point we've been talking about, in spite of the people, because they themselves are caught. One program officer once told me pretty early on, and it stuck with me, is that he has so much more influence outside his organization than inside his organization. Because when the program officer walks into a room, people are like, this person must really know some things because they get to see this field. And so learning to do that while also recognizing that doesn't mean you should promise people money. That doesn't mean that you should then be... Right. That doesn't necessarily mean you can give money easier, because inside your organization, you're still very constrained. So I think learning that there was huge constraints institutionally in many of the foundations we were working with, as I mentioned earlier, that people had to champion my idea inside their organization and their language, often to 2 or 3 or 4 levels, started to lessen my sense of the sort of power dynamic, that we were actually more alike than maybe some of the other folks in each of our institutions. And so that, I think, started to change my notion of power. And again, I recognize that both from a gender, racial, education background, I myself have plenty of privilege to be able to throw around in a room and to get access to things. But learning and sort of seeing it first as a real power imbalance, and learning that the power imbalance was much more complicated and multifaceted than I really understood it, I think started to mellow me out a little bit about building really powerful dynamic relationships with folks. But also, I think, changed the language I use in my proposals, because I realized I wasn't actually, we were both going to be talking to somebody else together. Yeah. I wasn't communicating with a program officer. But early on, it was like, why won't this program officer give me the money?
Right.
And then you start to realize, so that depth of understanding that people are part of processes and systems, and there's constraints and insufficiencies, changed my relationship.
Did you work much with major donors where those process constraints weren't in place?
We received one of the Mackenzie Scott grants, which I think is sort of part of this different way of doing things, right? So, I think I've joked before, like I got an email that I was sure was spam saying we want to talk to you about a confidential wealthy person interested in your organization.
I
was like,
start opening those emails. Gee,
right?
Yes.
Let me wire you my
exactly.
let me wire you my bank account money. And it's like you get in, especially in organizations, like don't open the emails, and so I ignored it twice, and then I got a call from somebody that was like, you're not opening the email. And we're for real. And I was like, oh,
the spam one?
So like, it's funny. Right. And so, through that process, we received, just about the largest grant we'd ever received with really no strings attached and very little processes. Now, I do tell people all the time, I was in 2 interviews with folks that I didn't know were part of this process. And so being ready when somebody asks you, what would you do with a lot of money, having good answers is really important. And so I've said all along to folks, like, you need to have a good 3 things to say if somebody asks you, what would you do with money, on ready all the time.
And it's always 3. It's never 2. It's never 4.
It's always 3. It's always 3, because 2 is a binary. You can't give people a binary. They will always be like, is there something else? I love this
conversation, and I'm going to pause here because, like, every good salesperson I know believes this rule, that it's 3 things. And everyone has a different reason why it's 3. One of my colleague says it's because odd numbers are organic and even numbers are inorganic, and so they feel more natural. Another one talks about the presence of Christian mythology in the 3. My personal thesis is because it has a beginning, middle, and an end. And so it sounds complete. 1, 2, and then 3 sounds complete. People nod and agree with you, and all you do is just saying 3 numbers. But they nod.
Absolutely.
Like, yes, that's correct.
I think that's right. I'd love to dive into the Christian roots of all of that. But and my partner, who often hears me on lots of calls, is always joking that I have 3 reasons for everything. But I actually, so I think what I would add to that is 2 other things. I think at one level, I've learned that it also allows you to have at least one that's pretty far out there. Right? Like there's also, if you just have 2 ideas and you're choosing between the doable and the not so doable, again, it feels like a binary, and you've given people a binary. We can either go here or we can go there. And it's like, but I kind of wanted, like, we're all trained to be like, I don't know about the binary. So I think giving people 3 allows people to do that. I've also found, frankly, because maybe sometimes even more than others, because I'm a verbal processor, that giving myself the 3rd option just as a mnemonic device is helpful, because once I explain 1 and 2, if I'm like, there's something else. And so just as a thought process, it's always been helpful for me to be like, let me leave room for that 3rd idea as we have this conversation, because that's a place where I can put maybe some of the more creative, some of the bolder, or in the process of the conversation really have. But I've found that it's really important, particularly for relationships with philanthropy, to provide people a set of choice points and a set of opportunities to see what resonates, because we're going to have to incubate it together, often over, 6, 7, 8 months, and maybe over years as we build towards something even bigger. So that's been my journey. And I think it allows people to not feel like you're giving them a binary choice, which I don't think is helpful.
The power, I think, Sasha, that you were able to get when philanthropy is transparent, right? When you have to stop guessing about what's happening, just the simplicity of like, oh, this program officer has to make a pitch to, someone else. And as we can continue to break down how those processes happens within institutions, is where we, where you start, you said you got some of like your small W wisdom. You were able to lean into like, they need me as much as I need them. But I don't think you can get there without the transparency that you were able to get to with some of those funders on how is this process actually going to play out for me? And I think that's really important for the fundraisers listening to this.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's an important one.
One of the things we love to do in service to the listener is get as applied and as tactical and as real life as possible. So many of these conversations end up with statements like, we need to understand that we're all in this together.
Yes.
And sure. So I want to get like as tactical as possible. So answers to these types of things in the past have been things like, last thing I want to do is listen to your deck. If you talk at me the whole time, you've lost me, right?
Yeah.
Those types of things. So as honest as you're willing to be, you and I are at a conference. I came to this conference specifically so that I could end up, quote marks, beside you in line for coffee.
Right. Yes.
What am I saying in that moment that gets your interest? What am I saying in that moment that turns you off immediately?
You're ruining my secret of meeting people in lines of coffee, Jeff. You're not supposed to tell people. I'm not supposed to tell people that that's how I meet everybody that I know.
My favorite thing there is the funder saw them, whatever, like 2 days ago, and has watched you for the last 2 days figure out how to be next to them in line for coffee.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's, well, so let me take one step back just because I do think that there's a little bit of pre-work that I think is important, both in the current space I'm in now and in my previous role. I think it is very important in whatever field anybody is raising money for them to know the essential players at the philanthropic level and understand how they work together and how you do that. So in our space, they're in education and sort of funding, education technology and the work we did. There was really, I mean, we never had more than 10 or 11 funders at any given time. And they all knew each other. They all spent a lot of time together. They all had their own networks of people. I think where I first met Kelly was in a network of funders. And so learning that I do think is really important because inevitably it's going to come down to those people both talking literally about you, but also starting to have facial recognition and name recognition and a sense of being a known entity in a certain space. Like this isn't this isn't an individual donor campaign we're talking about. This is about a discrete set of people who work in a discrete. So I start from there only because the random hoping that the person in line or hoping that the conference I went to is going to meet the person that I've never heard of who's also going to have money is just not something that I've found to be as productive. Though I suppose if I had a big enough team, we could fan out and do that. So I start there because to me, in those spaces, there are very important places and people to know who are seen as leaders in that space. And being able to engage with folks in that regard to build a relationship. So my initial interaction has always been about the question, who should I be talking to? And it seems really trite. And I think that's also like in networking 101, right? But like, instead of being in the line and being like, oh my God, let me tell you about my idea, which is my desire, because I'm like, I don't know how long this is going to last. It's a lot of curiosity about what's on their priority list. It's a lot of questions about, are they parts of these other networks? Who else do they work with? Especially if we're getting to know each other and we're completely unknown. But then it's, here's what we're working on. Like, who do you think we should talk to? Because my sense has always been that A, that prompts a different set of relationships. And B, the answer is often better than even them. Like they're introducing me to somebody might actually be the breakthrough. So as tactically as I can, I try to assume that I have a year to build a relationship before I get money from folks. It's really about saying, how can you help me plug into a network and an ecosystem of folks? Because that's where I know that the actual long-term power and opportunity comes from, not just how can I get something from you.
Right. I worked with one funder in the past who was kind of almost explicit, whereas if you approached them, the very first thing they did was send you on a roadshow tour of all of the other people they already fund.
Yeah.
And then they called them back and were like, what did you think? Like you had to audition through the circuit, basically.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of, because it's a vetting process, right? I mean, really what we're talking about is a vetting process. Like it is not just about your idea. And even here, as we think about judging this large number of applications, the criteria is both on the people as leaders who can lead a breakthrough, as well as is the breakthrough idea there. And I think everybody in philanthropy is doing some version of that, which is, can this person or this organization do it? And does it align with the things we want done? And I think expecting anybody to just do that up front with us is I think, unrealistic.
There's also things to unpack there around what is the risk of shortchanging that period of time where you're asking them questions, where they're starting to wonder, like, why is this person asking me all these questions? Who are they?
Yeah.
Right? That kind of balance, that curiosity, it takes some instinct. Materials. One of the things that I always encourage people to realize is the material is not the sale. You're the sale. The conversation is the sale. The material is the prop. Yeah. And in fact, if anything, it's the creation of the materials that matters with the person, not the thing itself. So what does that process look like in your ideal world? I'm trying to get money from you. How am I managing that co-creation materials process?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's no reason in my mind to send people or for somebody to send to me things that are already available. And so I resisted for a long time this question of, can you send me your deck? No, I can't. I can present my deck to you with my really cool stories and like the ways in which I want you to understand it. But sending my deck, it's like, you can read my mission statement and all these other things elsewhere. So I spent a lot of time writing personal emails to people. And I believe very much in the cold email, and I believe very much in the thoughtful reason.
You're answering as a fundraiser, and I was wondering if you answer as a funder.
Like we're trying to seduce you here. Thank you. I'm still learning. I'm still learning this identity shift. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So I think there's two things. I think one is understanding it's incumbent upon people to have done some homework. So if you're writing and asking about our grant cycle, I think it's possible for you to find that information on the website and understand the constraints, at least at some structural level, about how we give money. And so to me, engaging with me in some sense of, do you have funding available? I think just means that maybe you haven't done enough work to understand that we just don't have that. That's not how we give money. So that would be important to me is doing that. That's unfair maybe to offer to people who, why should they know that? But I feel like there's enough out there that would be reasonable. And then to me, the real important thing is engaging with me about the things that I am currently structured and employed to fund, which is a level of breakthrough funding that changes the conversation. So let's talk about breakthroughs. There's only so much I can do about your individual program grants. Right. And so coming in at the right elevation and coming in with the right kind of conversation would just get a lot more of my time and energy.
So what is your intellectual and creative catnip around those breakthroughs? Like, what could I say that I'd be the one who had to end the conversation, not you?
Yeah. Well, so we have three right now. One is on reading and the breaking through the over decades worth of inaccessible gains in reading and literacy. We currently have one on math and the role of executive function in math, and we have one on assessment and the role of assessment in the future of education. And so I think there is an opportunity for me, the opportunity of seeding new ways of thinking about old problems is really the thing that I am luckily positioned to be able to do in a way that says, what does it take? And so the part of that that's become most interesting is, what is the infrastructure required to enable and sustain somebody to do $25 to $40 million of R&D development for the future of education over 4 or 5 years? Like the infrastructure itself and the capacity to do that, given the constraints on data, the constraints on research, that's what I'm like really jazzed about these days. And infrastructure can seem really boring to people, but if we can't figure out ways to enable what every other field has, which is an R&D pipeline that everybody assumes is where creative, dynamic thoughts go to either live or die, I think we will continue to find ourselves in education where we are just really struggling on this incremental insufficiencies. And so breaking through on that, though, isn't just about the idea. It's about really finding the infrastructure and the ways in which we build the capacity for people to do that. Because I can say from my experiences here at AERDF, it is hard and it is challenging. And having a breakthrough is very different from proving one and seeing one develop over time. So that's what I've been most excited about, is what does that infrastructure look like? Who needs to be at the table? How do we build it? How do we think about it? So anybody that's interested in talking to me about money and fundraising and getting money from AERDF.
And those people, are they cornering you on your morning jog? Are they stalking you on Instagram? Are they cold emailing you? Are they getting an introduction through Kelly? Like, what is the ultimate channel, the single most ultimate channel to spark your attention?
Yeah. I think like everybody, I think if people come with a reference, it's just easier. I mean, I don't think my email
Definitely
is
me.
hidden anywhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if Kelly introduces, I mean, you're in. Like I'm already writing the check. I'm already writing the check. I think obviously coming through people that we share is important, but that's not always possible. I, again, as a big fan of the cold email in my previous role, I love a good, well-written, thoughtful, cold email about why we should find time to talk. And I will almost always say yes.
I
so
love that.
I don't have any problem of, I think most people would see me as very accessible. Obviously LinkedIn and those places I think can be a little bit dizzying in terms of the amount of information. But to me, cold emails and introduction emails, I'm all in. I don't even mind a little inflation of, I used to write emails a lot that said, I was talking to one of our current funders and they mentioned you, which was often not true. But I found that, but I wasn't like lying completely because we had conversations, but I found that people were interested in if somebody else in their field was talking about it. So you could use that probably and trick me with that any day.
Perfect.
I think you've maybe told a great narrative about your own trajectory of wanting to destroy systems, right? Early on, or break those down completely. And now this coming out the other side narrative of being able to break through them. So really appreciate you kind of sharing that journey with us, and excited to see how you kind of bring what you've learned into your role as a grant maker at AERDF. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks,
today.
Kelly.
And I just echo that thanks. And I can tell that you were a good fundraiser.
Yeah.
I can tell from your answers. And I'm hoping that as a funder, you extend some sympathy and allow some space.
Right on. I look forward. Yeah, maybe I can come back in a year and we can decide how I've done. We can have some people on to judge me on how I've done. That'd be great.
Huge thanks to Sasha Rabkin for the conversation and for the clarity, edge, and honesty he brought into the room.
If you want to explore these themes more deeply, fundraising, power, relationships, all of it, you can check out our workshop series at aspirationtech.org/HTRM.
Funders on Fundraising is co-produced by Chris Lawrence, plus Andrew Calloway and Decca Hussein Wetzel of Urbanist Media. Editing and mixing are also by Urbanist Media. It is hosted by me, Kelly James of Education First Consulting.
And me, Jeffrey McDougall of Aspiration. Our cover art is by Ben Johnson, and our original theme music is by Evan Greer.
This podcast is a production of Aspiration.
This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The views expressed here are those of the individuals, not their organizations.
To hear more episodes, find show notes, or get in touch, visit aspirationtech.org/podcast.